Good morning and welcome to our press conference for the release of our landmark report, Net Zero by 2050, a roadmap for the global energy sector. My name is Jad Mawad. I'm the head of communications at the International Energy Agency. This morning we're presenting the findings of one of our most important reports, which maps a pathway for the energy sector to meet ambitious climate goals. This is a report that was announced by our executive director during President Biden's Clean Energy Summit. We will be hearing from our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, as well as from Laura Cotti, our Chief Energy Modeler, and from Timur Gul, the head of our Energy Technology Perspectives Unit, who are the two main co-authors of the report.
So, before listening the results of our, in my view, landmark report from the leaders of this report, Mrs. Laura Cotti, who is our Chief Energy Modeler, and Dr. Timur Gul, who is the leading our technology work and the head of the Division for Energy Technology Perspectives, I wanted to briefly tell you three things. Why we decided, and why and when, I should say, decided to make this report, number one. Number two, what is the aim of this report? And number three, I want to give you some of the findings that I thought are important to underline. And as I said, my colleagues, Mrs. Cotti and Mr. Gul, will go into some of the key findings. Now, at the IEA, dear colleagues, we look at the entire energy sector. Every day, electricity, coal, renewables, new technologies, hydrogen, nuclear power, efficiency, all of them. And when we look all of them, we see some very encouraging developments as far as the clean energy, as far as our climate goals are concerned. What are those? We just published our renewables update. Again, record number of solar PV panels, wind going very strongly, record after another. Again, under Dr. Gül's leadership, we published a report on the status of the electric cars, huge sales record. These are good numbers. This is one, which makes us happy. Second, at the IEA, we work with almost every government around the world, both advanced economies and the developing countries, and we follow their policies closely. And we are very happy to note that many governments now are making commitments to bring their emissions to net zero by 2050. Very encouraging, those commitments. This is also good news, on top of the good news coming from some clean energy applications. But at the IEA, we believe in numbers. Our numbers, unfortunately, show that, as we have published only a few weeks ago, this year, global emissions will increase substantially, which is the second largest increase in the history. So therefore, my colleague Jet mentioned, as I mentioned also at Mr. President Biden's summit, there is a growing gap between the rhetoric we hear from governments, industry leaders, and what is happening in the real life. We hear a lot of commitments, a lot of pledges, but the numbers, emissions are going up. So therefore, we thought we are going to come up with a study that provides a roadmap for the global energy sector to bring the emissions to net zero by 2050 and what needs to happen and when do they have to happen in the energy sector so that one can easily compare government actions, with that roadmap and the milestones we have set. Last year, 2020, in our two flagship publications, World Energy Outlook and Energy Technology Perspectives, we have already made special cases and analysis on this 1.5 degrees future to understand our modeling capabilities, data, and how we can make a world, energy world, which is compatible with 1.5. I am also thankful more than 100 peer reviewers, scientists, academicians, the data colleagues and experts around the world. So, when I look at the results today, the first question I ask myself, as we get also from different colleagues, is it possible that the global energy sector, which is fossil fuel dominated today, 80% comes from fossil fuel, in 2050 comes to a net zero? The report, when I look at the report, I can summarize as follows. This pathway is a narrow one, it's a narrow pathway, but still achievable if the governments take bold and immediate action. What those actions are, I will, and Mrs. Kozy and Dr. Ag will come in a few minutes. The race is not between the countries, but the race is against the time today when you look at our numbers. Unless all the governments finishes the race, nobody can win. So therefore, a key topic of our study is the critical importance of international cooperation in the fight against climate change. So, dear colleagues, when we look at our numbers, I see our report, I see three big homework for all of us, governments, industry, citizens, academia. Number one, to make the most out of the existing clean energy options. What are those? I mentioned solar, which we crowned a couple of months ago as the new king of electricity markets. Solar, wind, onshore wind, offshore wind, energy efficiency, electric cars, in some countries nuclear power. So these are the first group of available technologies that we have to make the most out of. We don't use them as much as we should. We should use them much more compared to what we have today, and my colleagues will show the order of magnitude there. So this is one homework. Make the most out of the existing ones. Number two, why we do that, in parallel, we need to push the magic button of innovation. Because today, in addition to those technologies, we need other technologies to help us, especially around and after 2030, to reduce the emissions, such as advanced battery technologies, different hydrogen applications, or direct air capture. So there are many technologies that we need to incentivize governments and others to make them ready for the market. Those technologies are today under development, but we have to make them ready for the market. And the third, we have to reduce the use of fossil fuels substantially. So three jobs. One, make the most out of the existing clean energy options. Second, innovate the technologies under development, use them especially for the industry sector, long-haul transportation, aviation, shipping, and others. And third, reduce fossil fuel use. How this will happen? It will happen through, again, as it happened in the past, investments. Today, as we speak now, the world global energy investments for coal, oil, renewables, electricity, gas, for everything is about $2 trillion US. And this 2 trillion needs to go to 5 trillion by 2030. And not only that, today investment numbers are dominated by fossil fuels, and 2030 it should be dominated by clean energy options. So historical search for investments is needed to make this transformation in our energy system. I mentioned we work with IMF, and what we have found out working with the IMF colleagues is that this surge in historical search we hope to see from 2 trillion to 5 trillion leads to an additional 0.4 percentage point annual increase in the global GDP. So global GDP each year will grow an additional 0.4 percentage point, which is, as many of us know, a big deal. This is number one. Number two, on the jobs front, the huge expansion in the clean energy creates jobs. Solar panels, electrification, the networks, the energy efficiency, construction, buildings, manufacturing, and we calculate that this altogether make about 30 million additional jobs created. But at the same time, we also see that about 5 million jobs are lost, especially those who are dealing with the fossil fuel production or technologies related to fossil fuel use. And this is a major concern for us because we believe clean energy is for and about people. And in our report, we have made some recommendations to governments how they can address this issue, which is, in our view, critical. Last 2 points from me. Global energy system, how does it look like in 2050 if the governments follow the roadmap we have announced, we are announcing, in fact, today. When we look at today's energy system, it is dominated by fossil fuels. As I said, 80% of the energy comes from fossil fuels. In the year 2050, IEA's roadmap comes up with a completely different picture, which is dominated by clean energy. If I have to give you one example, solar, the share of solar in the total energy today is about 1%, and it will go up in 2050 in our pathway to 20%, and as such, solar in 2050 becomes the single largest source of global energy mix. Wind, hydrogen, they will be dominating the global energy mix in the year 2050 in our roadmap. So, dear colleagues, let me finish by one of the, in my view, important aspects of our work, namely We are a pragmatic organization. We came up with more than 400 milestones what the governments need to do and when do they have to do it so that we can reach our climate targets, 1.5 degrees Celsius. More than 400, as I said, and this would help us to track the government's decisions, developments, whether or not countries are on or off track vis-à-vis their targets. I will give you a couple of milestones that our report comes up. One of them is, given the big decline in oil, gas, and coal, as of this year, there is no need for new fossil fuel supply investments, oil, gas, and coal. Second, as of this year, no more unabated coal-fired power plants built around the world. Another one, in the year 2035, no new sales of internal combustion engine cars, the cars that which are dominating our streets today. As of 2035, no more sales of these cars. 2040, global power system in net terms becomes carbon free. So these are some of the milestones of our work, and these are, again, we put them so that we don't only make a 2050 what needs to happen, or as it is the case nowadays in social media sending tweets left and right. We wanted to make, as it is a tradition in the IEA, a rigorous analysis, pragmatic suggestions, even though the challenge is very, very high. And we are working with a few governments, and we will be working with more and more governments to help them on the basis of this expertise we have built at the IEA to draw their national roadmaps, we hope are in line with the 1.5 degrees target that we all, I hope, all of us commit to. With this, I would like now turn to my colleague, Laura Cosi, and I would like to, in front of you, dear colleagues, friends following us, once again, I would like to thank my colleagues, Laura Cosi, Timur Gül, and the entire huge team of experts finishing this study in 8 months of time, which is a record for such an in-depth study. Thank you very much, and over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol, and it's my pleasure with Dr. Gül to go through the key findings of the report. Let me start with just giving you a visual impression of where we sit in terms of comparison with comparable IPCC 1.5 scenarios that have been really one of our key comparison points throughout the course of the development of the study since September last year. Well, what you can see here is the following. The levers that we use are broadly similar, but there are some important differences in terms of levers that we use more and levers that we use a bit less. Let me start with maybe discussing carbon dioxide removal. We are among the lowest use across comparable IPCC scenarios, very similar in terms of utilization of carbon capture, utilization and storage, and certainly the lowest in terms of bioenergy use. On the other side, we are gonna, our roadmap, our pathway uses more electrification, more solar and wind, and more hydrogen. So this is really a bit of a nutshell. What are the key levers that we are using to reach net zero by 2050? But as the executive director mentioned at the very beginning of his speech, we really find that the pathway to net zero is narrow but still feasible. And why do we say that? We look at the next 10 years, the next decade. The next decade, we call it really the decade of massive clean energy expansion. But the good news is that the 13 gigaton emission reduction that the energy sector needs to achieve from now to 2030, well, we have all the technologies that we need to cut emissions by 13 gigatons. And the good news is that most of them are here, are on the market, are cheaper than the alternative.
As Ms. Cosi already mentioned in the beginning of her speech, and also Dr. Birol highlighted, we basically have all the technologies ready and available in the market to make the significant reductions that we need from the energy sector in terms of CO2 emissions by the year 2030 to stay on track towards net zero CO2 from the energy sector by the year 2050. From energy efficiency to renewables, from renewables to electric cars and many more, we have the means to cut emissions from the global energy sector. But what we are highlighting in our report is that the full transition to net zero emissions by the year 2050 will require more technology efforts than that. We need to decarbonize more than the power sector. We need to decarbonize more than electric cars. We need to do more than just making our way of consuming energy more efficient. We will need to tackle emissions also in various different other parts of the energy system, including long-distance transport, such as planes, ships, heavy-duty trucks, or the various different industries, heavy industries in particular, cement production, iron and steel production, chemical industry, and many, many more. In these kind of sectors, we know the technologies that can help the full decarbonization, but we don't have them in the market today as yet ready to be scaled. Many of these technologies are today still at demonstration or even prototype stage, and by the year 2050, almost half of the emission savings for achieving net zero emissions by that time will need to come from technologies, such technologies that are currently under development. We need to bring them into the market. So what are these kind of technology options? They broadly fall into four main categories. That's technologies to help enable electrification of end users. It's technologies for carbon capture, utilization and storage. It's technologies for the production and use of hydrogen. And it's sustainable bioenergy technologies as well. You see a couple of options here. Advanced battery designs, for example, that can provide a step change in energy density and help enable not only the electrification of heavy-duty trucks, but also short-distance ships and possibly even short-distance flights. We will need to successfully demonstrate CO2 capture in the cement industry to address process emissions. We'll need to look at carbon dioxide removal technologies, such as direct air capture, for example, both to offset residual emissions that are still there and therefore help to advance the date of net zero emissions, but also to help produce synthetic fuels for aviation. Hydrogen, as I mentioned, another key area where we are making great progress in many areas, but we need to bring several technologies, in particular on the demand side, into the market. Hydrogen-based steel making is one such example. It is important to recognize that the deployment of the technologies that we have today in the market and innovating on the technologies that we don't quite yet have fully in the market, these are not antagonists in the fight against climate change. They are actually two sides of the same coin. This decade, and this is the message that comes from our report, this decade must be both the time of accelerated deployments of the technologies that we have and the time of accelerated innovation to prepare the next generation of clean energy technologies towards a net zero transition by 2050. For governments, we have identified two key aspects here that I would like to bring to your attention. First, we need to increase investment in demonstration projects. Our analysis shows that roughly $90 billion need to be mobilized as soon as possible to complete the portfolio of demonstration projects before the year 2030. And this compares with roughly $25 billion that have been budgeted today. And second, we need to bring international cooperation to a new height, accelerating innovation, developing international standards, coordinating to scale up technologies in such a way that links the national market. Let us now turn to energy security, which of course can improve through decarbonizing and domestic sourcing of energy. What we are seeing in our projections in our net zero 2050 pathway is not that we are getting out of oil and gas entirely, but we are seeing a significant drop in oil and gas demand. And the result is that no new oil and natural gas fields are approved for development in this pathway. The result of this reaction is that supplies become increasingly concentrated in a small number of low-cost producers. A second important area of security to be mindful of is that we will require substantial quantities of critical minerals through the scale-up of clean energy technologies such as wind, solar PV, batteries. All these require larger quantities of minerals than we are using today. Minerals like copper, cobalt, manganese, and various rare earth metals. We have put out a report on the role of critical minerals just last week, and we find here that in our net zero pathway, already by 2030, the demand for these minerals is seven-fold higher than today. The point here is that current production and processing for many of these minerals is more geographically concentrated than is the case of for oil and natural gas, and so this could create new energy security concerns which need to be addressed heads-on, of course. Finally, there are potential new vulnerabilities associated with the need to maintain reliable, flexible, and secure electricity systems. In our scenario, electricity becomes the largest source of final energy demand by the year 2050. Additional electricity needs come from the production of low-carbon hydrogen, hydrogen-derived fuels, and at the same time, the share of solar PV and wind rises to almost 70% by the year 2050. The result is, as you see here, that the need for electricity system flexibility about quadruples towards 2050, with the sources of flexibility shifting away from unabated fossil fuels that are retired towards demand-side response, battery storage systems, and dispatchable low-emission sources from hydropower to hydrogen to plants that are equipped with CCUS. Naturally, with the increasing importance of electricity for the energy sector, and not only for our buildings, but also transport, industries, etc., there's also a need to enhance the resilience of electricity systems to other emerging threats such as cybersecurity. What our report presents in detail is a pathway to net zero emissions by the year 2050, and we are seeing an increasing number of governments and companies making their own plans for reaching net zero emissions in the long term. Some earlier than 2050, some later. These are all excellent efforts, of course, but net zero pledges have to come, of course, with intermediate policies, intermediate milestones that are achieved along the way. In our pathway, we identify many such milestones for technology innovation, for technology deployment, for policy. Ms. Cosi already mentioned a number of them. We have actually set out more than 400 such milestones at a global level in our report that are the outcome of our scenario analysis. It is of course important here to recognize that this is a global analysis, and every country has its own circumstances, will make its own plans for the transition to net zero emissions depending on its own priorities and preferences. But our milestones that we are setting out will hopefully give a sense of the pace and scale involved with a global transition to net zero emissions. Let me highlight, there are more than 400, many more than you see here on this particular slide, but let me highlight 3 of them that are particularly interesting, I believe. First one is about hydrogen, which is set to become an increasingly important part of our energy mix on the road to net zero emissions by 2050. Already in 2030, low-carbon hydrogen supplies become 150 million tons from next to nothing today. The production of these low-carbon hydrogen supplies brings about a huge jump in electrolyzer capacity. We have roughly 250 megawatt of electrolyzers installed today. In our net zero emission pathway, already by the year 2030, these 250 megawatt of today jump to 850 gigawatt, so a factor of more than 3,000 larger over the next 10 years, which may sound daunting, of course, is clearly ambitious. But when you look at the project pipeline, according to our numbers, we could already be at 110 gigawatts by the year 2030, only on the basis of the project pipeline that we are measuring today. But what this means is, essentially, there's still a factor 8 difference roughly between what has to be achieved and what is in the project pipeline. What it means is that electrolyzers, as many other technologies, need to repeat the history of scaling up ambition that we have seen for solar PV and more recently with electric cars, month after month and year after year, in order to reach net zero emissions in the long run. Second, we have mentioned the power sector already, and Ms. Cosi mentioned that it's the first largest sector that decarbonizes entirely in our projections. We have many technologies, practically all of them available to decarbonize electricity generation. By the year 2040, net zero emissions from the global electricity sector is reached in our net zero 2050 pathway, and as early as 2035 overall in advanced economies. Finally, as mentioned earlier, renewables become the dominant source of electricity generation in our net zero emission pathway. By the year 2050, about 90% of electricity generation come from renewables and 70% from solar PV and wind alone. I would like to conclude our presentation by saying that we perfectly acknowledge, of course, that our scenario is a pathway and not the pathway to net zero emissions by the year 2050. We have analyzed a couple of other such pathways in our report, looking at some of the key uncertainties from bioenergy to CCS to behavior and others. We do hope, though, that our report, with the details, the pragmatic recommendations that it sets out, will inform and stimulate the debate on how our collective climate goals can be achieved in practice. Thank you very much for your attention.